Is Paul's letter to someone who feels God is silent. Have you ever begged for an answer and all you heard was silence? Comment where you are watching from and what silence you are facing. Subscribe. The next letter might be for you. My dear friend, whose heart I sense crying out in the echoing chambers of unanswered prayer, I am Paul, servant of Christ Jesus, writing to you from a place I never expected to find myself. Not just this Roman prison where my chains have become my companions, but from the deeper prison of divine silence that has at times felt more confining than these iron shackles around my wrists. I write to you because I know the weight of silence. I know what it feels like to pour your heart out to heaven and hear nothing but the echo of your own desperation bouncing back. I know the crushing loneliness of feeling like God has stepped away from the conversation just when you need him most. I know the doubt that creeps in when prayers feel like they dissolve into thin air, leaving you wondering if anyone is listening at all. You have been there, haven't you? In that dark place where your words feel small and God feels absent. Where you have whispered, pleaded, even shouted into the darkness, begging for just one word, one sign, one whisper of acknowledgement that your pain matters to the one who created you. The silence has become so heavy, you can almost touch it. So thick it feels like it might suffocate the last ember of faith still flickering in your chest. Let me tell you about my own encounters with God's silence, because I need you to understand that even I, who have seen blinding light on the Damascus Road, who have been caught up to the third heaven, who have planted churches and written letters that will outlive empires, even I have known seasons when heaven felt sealed shut above my head. There was a thorn in my flesh, a messenger of Satan sent to torment me. 3 times I pleaded with the Lord to take it away. 3 times I fell on my face before him, pouring out my desperation, my need, my absolute conviction that removing this burden would make me more effective for his kingdom. 3 times I waited for the answer I was certain would come, the healing I knew he could provide, the relief I believed he wanted to give. And 3 times I was met with what felt like silence. Not the absence of God, though it felt like it at the time, but something far more mysterious and, I would later understand, far more precious. It was in that apparent silence that I heard the whisper that would change everything. My grace is sufficient for you, for my power is made perfect in weakness. But before I heard those words, there were nights when I wondered if I had somehow fallen out of favor with the God I had given my life to serve. There were moments when I questioned whether my prayers were even reaching beyond the ceiling of my prison cell. There were seasons when the silence felt like rejection, like abandonment, like evidence that perhaps I had misunderstood my calling entirely. I remember lying on the cold stone floor of various prisons, my back still burning from fresh whip marks, my body aching from beatings, my heart heavy with the betrayal of friends who had promised to stand with me but disappeared when standing became costly. In those moments I cried out to God with an intensity that came from the deepest wells of human desperation. I begged for deliverance, for vindication, for some sign that my suffering had meaning and purpose. The silence that followed felt deafening, not just the absence of an audible voice, but the absence of any tangible evidence that my prayers had been heard, received, or valued. Days would pass, then weeks, sometimes months, with no dramatic rescue, no miraculous intervention, no clear word from heaven about what I was supposed to do next or how long I was supposed to endure. But I need you to understand something that took me years to grasp. God's silence is not God's absence. The quietness you perceive is not evidence of his indifference. The lack of immediate answers does not mean your prayers are unheard or unimportant. Sometimes God's most profound work happens in the apparent silence, in the spaces between your desperate pleas and his ultimate response. I learned this truth in the most unexpected place. It was during my second imprisonment in Rome, when even my closest companions had left me. Timothy was in Ephesus, Luke was my only remaining companion, and I was facing the very real possibility of execution. I had spent decades pouring my life out for the gospel, enduring hardships that would have broken lesser men, and now I found myself essentially alone, waiting for a trial that might end in my death. In that solitude, something remarkable happened. The silence I had once feared became the space where I encountered God in ways I had never experienced before. It was not that he began speaking more loudly. It was that I began listening more deeply. The desperation that had once driven me to demand immediate answers began to transform into a patience that could wait for His perfect timing. I realized that some of my most frantic prayers for deliverance had actually been prayers for God to work according to my timeline rather than His wisdom. Some of my most passionate pleas for Him to speak had been requests for Him to confirm what I already wanted to hear, rather than to reveal what I actually needed to know. The silence became a teacher, instructing me in the difference between wanting God to serve my agenda and learning to trust His sovereign plan. Let me share with you what I discovered about prayer during those long seasons of apparent divine silence. I had always understood prayer as conversation, as dialogue, as an exchange of words and responses between myself and my Heavenly Father. But I began to realize that some of the most important communication happens in the wordless spaces, in the quiet moments when two hearts commune beyond the limitations of language. The Spirit helps us in our weakness, interceding for us with groanings that words cannot express. I wrote those words to the Romans from a place of deep personal experience. There were times when my own words felt inadequate to express the depth of my need, the complexity of my circumstances, or the intensity of my longing for God's intervention. In those moments, I learned to trust that the Holy Spirit was translating my wordless desperation into prayers that perfectly aligned with the Father's will. Your tears are prayers. Your sighs are intercession. Your sleepless nights spent staring at the ceiling, wrestling with questions that have no easy answers, are sacred conversations with a God who sees, understands, and responds in ways that transcend your limited perspective on timing and methods. I think of the night in Jerusalem when I knew my ministry as I had known it was coming to an end. The crowds that had once hung on my every word were now calling for my blood. The religious leaders who should have recognized the authenticity of my message were orchestrating my arrest. Even some of my fellow believers were beginning to distance themselves, afraid of being associated with someone who had become so controversial. I spent that entire night in prayer, begging God for clarity, for direction, for some indication of what He wanted me to do. Should I flee the city? Should I modify my message to make it more palatable? Should I find a way to appease my accusers while still maintaining my integrity? I poured out my heart with an honesty that left me exhausted, emotionally drained, and spiritually raw. The answer I received was not what I expected. It was not a detailed plan for escape or a strategy for avoiding persecution. It was simply this: take courage, for as you have testified about me in Jerusalem, so you must also testify in Rome. No explanation of how this would happen, no timeline for when it would occur, no assurance that the journey would be easy or pleasant. Just a quiet confidence that my current circumstances were not the end of my story. That word sustained me through a false trial, a dangerous sea voyage, a shipwreck, and eventual imprisonment in Rome. But it came after hours of what felt like praying into a void, after a night of wrestling with silence that seemed to mock my desperation. The answer came not as a dramatic revelation, but as a quiet settling in my spirit, a peace that transcended my circumstances, even though those circumstances had not changed. I want you to understand that God's silence does not mean He is not working. Some of His most important work happens invisibly, in the quiet recesses of your heart, where transformation occurs without fanfare or external validation. The silence you are experiencing may be the cocoon within which God is doing something beautiful and necessary that could not happen any other way. Consider the years Jesus spent in Nazareth before His public ministry began. 30 years of apparent silence, of ordinary life, of waiting for the right moment to step into His ultimate purpose. Those were not wasted years or years when God was absent. They were years of preparation, of growth, of becoming ready for what lay ahead. Your seasons of silence may be serving a similar purpose, preparing you for something you cannot yet see or imagine. I learned to distinguish between God's silence and God's absence during my 3 years in Arabia after my conversion. Fresh from my dramatic encounter with Christ on the Damascus Road, I expected my new life of faith to be marked by constant divine communication, regular miraculous interventions, and clear direction at every turn. Instead, I found myself in a desert, both literally and figuratively, where the primary sounds were wind, silence, and the echo of my own questions. During those years, God did not speak to me in the ways I expected or wanted. There were no burning bushes, no angelic visitations, no audible voices giving me step-by-step instructions for my future ministry. There was just the daily discipline of learning to trust Him without constant confirmation, to believe in His goodness without continuous evidence, to love Him even when He felt distant. It was in that desert that I learned the difference between seeking God's hand and seeking God's face. I had been so focused on what I wanted Him to do for me that I had lost sight of who He was inviting me to become. The silence became a gift that forced me to move beyond a relationship based on transactions to one grounded in genuine intimacy. Your current season of silence may be God's invitation to know Him in ways that are impossible when He is constantly responding to your requests and solving your problems. He may be calling you deeper, beyond the surface level of "give me this and fix that," into the profound depths of "I trust you regardless and I love you anyway." I want to address the fear that often accompanies God's silence, the fear that you have somehow disqualified yourself from His attention. Perhaps you have convinced yourself that your past mistakes, your current struggles, or your wavering faith have caused God to withdraw His presence from your life. Maybe you believe that the silence is punishment for some failure you cannot even identify. Let me speak directly to that fear. God's love for you is not dependent on your performance. His willingness to communicate with you is not contingent on your perfection. The silence you are experiencing is not evidence of His disappointment in you or His decision to give up on you. Some of the most spiritually mature people in history have walked through extended seasons of divine silence, not because they were less faithful, but because they were being prepared for greater purposes. Mother Teresa, one of the most recognized saints of the modern era, wrote extensively about the dark night of the soul she experienced for decades. She described feeling as though her prayers were falling into an empty space where there is no one to receive them. Yet during this very period of felt abandonment, she was serving the poorest of the poor with extraordinary compassion and love. Her silence was not evidence of God's absence, but of her deep union with the suffering Christ. John of the Cross wrote about the dark night of the soul as a necessary stage in spiritual development, a time when God withdraws the consolations of faith to teach the soul to love Him for who He is, rather than for what He provides. This darkness is not punishment but promotion, not rejection but deeper intimacy. Your silence may be God's way of weaning you off dependence on feelings and experiences and teaching you to walk by faith alone. He may be developing in you a trust that does not require constant reassurance, a love that does not demand continuous validation, a hope that can endure even when circumstances provide no reason for optimism. I remember the night before my final trial in Rome, when I knew that morning might bring news of my execution. I had spent years proclaiming that to live is Christ and to die is gain, but facing the actual possibility of death brought those words into sharp, personal focus. I found myself in the deepest prayer of my life, not asking for deliverance, but asking for the grace to face whatever came with dignity and faith. The response I received was not dramatic or overwhelming. It was simply a quiet assurance that whether I lived or died, I belonged to Christ, and nothing could separate me from His love. No angels appeared, no voices spoke from heaven, no miraculous rescue was promised, just a deep, abiding peace that transcended my circumstances and my fears. That peace, that quiet confidence was God's answer to my prayer. Not the answer I might have chosen, not the response my flesh desired, but exactly what my spirit needed. The silence had not been empty. It had been full of a presence too deep for words, a love too profound for expression, a peace too complete for explanation. I want you to consider the possibility that God is speaking to you even now, but in a language you may not have learned to recognize. He speaks through the sunrise that greets you each morning, despite your sleepless night. He communicates through the friend who calls at exactly the moment you feel most alone. He responds through the verse that catches your attention as you flip randomly through pages of Scripture you have read 100 times before. God's voice is not always audible. his presence not always tangible, his responses not always immediate or obvious. Sometimes he speaks through circumstances that slowly align to reveal his purposes. Sometimes he communicates through the gradual transformation he works in your character during seasons of waiting. Sometimes his answer is the strength he provides to endure, rather than the deliverance you requested. The silence you are experiencing may actually be God's way of preparing you to hear him more clearly when he does speak. Like a musician, learning to appreciate the rests between notes that give music its rhythm and beauty, you may be learning to recognize the sacred pauses that make God's eventual words more meaningful and impactful. I learned this lesson during my time in Philippi, locked in an inner prison with my feet fastened in stocks. Silas and I had been brutally beaten, our backs torn open by Roman whips, our bodies broken and bleeding. As night fell and the other prisoners settled into sleep, we found ourselves faced with a choice. We could spend the night cursing our circumstances and demanding to know why God had allowed this suffering, or we could choose to worship despite our pain. We chose to sing, not because we felt like singing, not because our circumstances had improved, not because we had received some special revelation about why we were suffering. We sang because we had learned that worship is not dependent on feelings or circumstances, but on the unchanging character of God. And in our singing, something miraculous happened. Not just the earthquake that shook the prison foundations and opened all the doors, but something more profound. We discovered that God had been present in our suffering all along. The silence we might have interpreted as absence was actually the space where his presence became most real and powerful. Your current season of silence may be preparing you for your own midnight song. God may be teaching you to worship not because of what he does for you, but because of who he is. He may be developing in you a faith that can sing in the darkness, hope in the midst of despair, and love that persists even when love seems unreturned. Let me share with you what I have learned about waiting for God to speak. Waiting is not passive inactivity, it is active trust. Waiting is not resignation to hopelessness, it is expectant faith. Waiting is not evidence that God has forgotten you. It is proof that his timing is perfect, even when ours is impatient. During my house arrest in Rome, I spent 2 years in a form of exile from the active ministry I had known and loved. I could not travel, could not plant new churches, could not stand before crowds and proclaim the gospel with the freedom I had once enjoyed. In human terms, it appeared that my most productive years were being wasted in confinement and limitation. But it was during those 2 years of apparent silence and restriction that I wrote some of my most important letters. Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, and Philemon were all born from that season of forced stillness. The words that would encourage believers for centuries to come, the theological insights that would shape Christian understanding for generations, the pastoral wisdom that would comfort countless hearts, emerged from what appeared to be a period of divine silence and human limitation. God was not silent during those years. He was simply speaking in a different language. Instead of the dramatic conversions and miraculous healings that had marked my earlier ministry, he was giving me words that would have impact far beyond anything I could have imagined. The silence was not empty. It was pregnant with purposes I could not yet see. Your season of silence may be similarly pregnant with possibilities. God may be preparing to speak through you in ways that are only possible because of what you are learning in the quiet. The depth you are gaining through wrestling with his apparent absence may become the foundation for ministry to others who face similar struggles. I want to address the loneliness that often accompanies God's silence. When heaven feels closed and prayers seem to evaporate before they reach their destination, it is easy to feel utterly alone in the universe. The silence can become so overwhelming that you begin to question not just whether God is listening, but whether he even exists at all. This loneliness is real and valid, but it is not the complete picture. Even when you cannot sense God's presence, you are surrounded by a cloud of witnesses who have walked this same path. Abraham waited 25 years for the promise of a son. Joseph spent years in prison for a crime he did not commit. David hid in caves while the man he was anointed to replace hunted him like an animal. Jesus himself cried out from the cross, my God, why have you forsaken me?" You are part of a long line of faithful people who have discovered that God's silence does not equal God's absence, that his delayed response does not indicate his disinterest, that his mysterious timing does not reflect his diminished love. You are not alone in your struggle to understand why the God who has the power to speak worlds into existence sometimes chooses to remain quiet when his children are crying out for help. But you're also not alone in discovering that some of life's most profound spiritual growth happens in the apparent silence, that some of the deepest intimacy with God develops during seasons when he feels most distant, that some of the strongest faith emerges from periods when believing requires the most courage. The silence you are experiencing is not punishment, it is preparation. It is not rejection, it is refinement. It is not evidence that God has stopped caring. It is proof that he cares so much he is willing to remain quiet while you develop the spiritual muscles necessary for what lies ahead. I think of the Israelites in Egypt, crying out under the burden of slavery for 400 years. From their perspective, God was silent, absent, uncaring about their suffering. They had no way of knowing that during those centuries of apparent divine indifference, he was preparing a deliverer, orchestrating circumstances across nations, positioning people and events for the most dramatic rescue in human history. The silence was not empty, it was full of preparation. The waiting was not wasted, it was necessary. The apparent absence was actually the hidden presence of a God working behind the scenes in ways too complex and comprehensive for human understanding. Your silence may be serving a similar purpose. While you wait and wonder and sometimes despair, God may be arranging circumstances, preparing people, developing your character, and orchestrating events in ways you cannot see or imagine. The rescue you are hoping for may require preparations you know nothing about. The answer you are seeking may depend on developments that are still in process. As I prepare to close this letter, I want to leave you with the most important truth I have learned about God's silence. It is temporary. Not because I can promise you that God will speak audibly tomorrow or that your circumstances will change dramatically next week, but because I know that silence is never God's final word. He who began a good work in you will bring it to completion, even if the completion looks different from what you originally expected. The God who spoke light into darkness, who called dry bones to live, who raised his Son from the dead has not lost his voice. He has not forgotten how to communicate with his children. He has not grown tired of your prayers or bored with your requests. He is still the same God who has been speaking throughout history, and he will speak again in your life. But until he does, trust that the silence is sacred space where he is doing something beautiful and necessary. Trust that your prayers are heard even when they seem to disappear into the void. Trust that he is present even when he feels absent, working even when he seems inactive, loving you even when love feels unreturned. The night is not permanent. The silence will not last forever. The dawn is coming, and with it, the voice you long to hear will speak words of comfort, direction, and hope that will make the waiting worthwhile. I have written this letter with tears, remembering my own seasons of divine silence and the profound ways God used those seasons to deepen my faith and expand my understanding. I pray that it finds you where God seems to have fallen silent and reminds you that silence is not the absence of God, but often his most intimate presence. If you felt something stir in your heart as you heard these words, write in the comments, what has God not been saying that you wish he would? Share your silence with others who understand. Let your struggle become a bridge to community rather than a wall of isolation. Subscribe to this channel. The next letter might be the answer you have been waiting for. With faith and tears, Paul.